Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome to a special edition of The World Over Live. We have great guests on this show, but oh, what a guest we've got for you tonight. It's a rare interview. He is the author of over 70 books and countless short stories. He's had 14 New York Times bestsellers, and he is one of the best-selling authors of suspense working today. His latest novel, Odd Apocalypse, is the continuation of his popular Odd Thomas series, the fifth book of a planned 7. I sat down with him recently at his home in Southern California, and we talked about the craft of writing, where his inspiration derives, and the faith and family life that shaped so much of his work. Here in an exclusive and personal interview is DEAN KOONTZ. Take a look. Let's talk about this career. My hometown newspaper, the Times-Picayune, once compared your work to that of Flannery O'Connor's and Walker Percy's. They are two of the certainly most recognized Catholic authors. Do you consider yourself a Catholic author?
Yes, probably even before I quite realized that the faith was so infusing the books. That actually was a review of an earlier novel.
Really?
And when I saw that, I was really sort of, it's almost embarrassed when you get praise like that, because you feel, no, I'm not deserving of that, because I really like both those writers, and it seemed I haven't earned that. But somebody saw something in my writing that I was only, let's say, more than subconsciously aware of, but not fully consciously aware of as I became over the years.
No, and it's quite, I mean, this is an exceptional career. 50 plus books. 400 million copies sold. Do you ever step back when you walk down you have a hallway in your home with all of your editions in various languages. It goes on and on. Do you ever step back and go, where did this all come from?
It's astonishing, because back in the day, I was working in the poverty program for a year, then I was teaching school, and Gerda knew I was selling short stories and a couple of paperback novels, not making very much money, and she knew I wanted to do this as a full-time career, so she said, I will support you for 5 years, and if you can't make it in 5 years, you'll never make it. And I tried to negotiate her up to 7, but she has Sicilian blood, so she wins every negotiation, and I took her up on that, and most people in the family felt I was a useless bum, and I sort of felt that way at times, but I worked very hard, and I knew I was working hard. And at the end of those 5 years, she was able to quit her job and go to work taking care of the business side of this. And when we sat down that time, how much would we have to earn reliably to be able to do this for a living? Our goal was $25,000 a year reliably. And we never saw coming what was coming. I don't think anyone could. And it happened gradually. It was many years till I had a bestseller.
Yeah, it took, you worked a long time perfecting your craft along the way. But I am amazed, and we'll get into it in a little bit, the sheer volume of output as an author. I mean, it's for someone who writes, it is shocking how much your productivity. You must have a work ethic that never tires. You write every day, I imagine.
I get up every morning at 5:45. By the time I've showered and walked the dog and gotten to my office, it might be 7:30, 7:15, and I have breakfast at my desk. I never eat lunch, and I work through till dinner, and I do that 6 days a week. Sometimes 5, but if it's the last month of a book, yes, it's going to be 6 days, and then it'll be more hours than that too. I love long work sessions where you get so deeply into the story it becomes real to you, and that, I think, makes it more real. If it becomes real to me, it becomes real to the reader.
Now, I read a biography of you. In that biography, they made the case, or the argument, that so much of your work comes from your personal experience. As I read that and read several interviews with you, the experience of your childhood looms large over your work and your life. Tell me about your father, Ray Koontz.
Well, my dad I didn't know what was wrong with my dad when I was a child. I didn't even know it until I was much later in life. But I knew he was an alcoholic because he was drunk much of the time. He had 44 jobs in 34 years. He would punch out the boss from time to time, and that's not a good move. And we never knew whether we were going to have a roof over our heads or where the food was coming from. My mom started working in a five and dime, and she was sort of the breadwinner of the family, but it wasn't much.
Had to be terrifying for you and your mother.
To a degree, and he would threaten to kill us frequently, but he would get into those things where life would go very badly for him. He had no faith, really, but then when things would go very badly and he would maybe end up in jail or in a bar fight or this or that, then he would suddenly take out the Bible and begin to read and declaim over it. And as a kid, I say this, it was a dark kind of childhood, but I was not an unhappy child. And when I first ever talked about it, I began to realize people thought, oh, what a poor, sad child. But in reality, even as a child, I knew that happiness was a choice. And you could always find something in the worst of times to make you happy. That didn't make the worst times go away, but it meant that there was a way out of this. And for me, very young, it became books. There were no books in our house, so I would get them from the library. And by reading, I discovered very important things. And number one was, not all families were like this. When you're growing up in that environment, you assume that this is normal. And when you find out it's not normal, that gives you something important to shoot for.
You said the benefit of my childhood is to show that there is evil in the world and that you have to find a way to thread through it, reject it, and find other ways to live. How bad was it?
My mother protected me from most of the physical violence, but he would turn that violence on her. There was a lot of verbal abuse and that sort of thing. And it was more the poverty of it, that the never knowing what was coming tomorrow and the worry that was always there with my mother. My mother was quite a wonderful person, and it really ate at me as a child to see that her life was so full of worry. She died at 53 of a series of strokes, and I think a lot of it had to do with the terrible pressure she lived in, within that marriage.
And you were raised in the United Church of Christ. And then you meet your wife, Gerda. You met, apparently, you were showing me a great picture of you all as children.
Well, I didn't know it, but I was a senior in high school and she was a junior when we met. But then when I later asked her to marry me, my mother said, I think I have a picture of the two of you as children at a birthday party. And I think I was 3 and Gerda was probably 2.5. I was 3.5 maybe. And we're sitting directly across the table from each other in this crowd of children. And it's a wonderful thing to have on my desk because it does seem like destiny.
I'll say. And she and her family, I guess, embodied what a Catholic family was, and it was so different from the experience you had lived.
Much of the time we went on dates, we would go to Johnstown, which was one town removed from Bedford, and a lot of her aunts and uncles lived there. And we would visit each of them, and everywhere we went, we were offered food or a little homemade wine, and everybody was very happy with everybody else. And in my family, people weren't speaking to each other all the time. There was somebody else speaking to somebody else. There was a lot of anguish and angst throughout the family. And here was something that was, to me, totally different. And I began to associate that with Catholicism. And then in college was when I made the decision. Gerda never asked me to convert. But when I was in college, I decided I was going to read about it. I started reading Chesterton and a number of other people and was drawn to it. And I said, yes, this is the other way to live that is much better.
And it has transformed not only your life, but your work. I mean, the thing, and I'm amazed by the people I encounter, whether I'm on a plane or I'm at a conference, and it's everyone from CEOs to housewives to princes of the church, reading your novels. There is, there are very few authors I can say this about, or that frankly I would take the time to interview in this way because the work is superficial or predictable, not yours. Between the lines, one senses and feels this supernatural pulse, the vying of good and evil. How conscious of you are that of that when you're in the process of writing?
I'm conscious of it to a degree because writing is a craft and you have to craft the words. A lot of it comes to you sometimes by surprise. I've had whole novel ideas come to me that I have no clue where they came from. I often say that when you're writing and things are going very well, something begins to happen that you feel like you're in touch with that higher creativity that is God. And if something comes to you, like I was writing a novel called The Face, which has a very big spiritual ending to it.
Yep.
And in the middle of it, these lines came into my head. My name is Odd Thomas. I lead an unusual life. Now, that doesn't come from anything I've thought about, considered. I turned around to write them down in a yellow legal pad I keep beside me. And the next thing I knew, I was writing the whole first chapter by hand. And I never before or since have written by hand. I'd usually do 20 or 30 drafts a page because I really like the English language and I want it to be as tight and polished as I can. And this I wrote out by hand, did a whole chapter in several hours, and put it aside saying, I have to finish The Face. That's what I'm writing now. When I went back to that handwritten piece, I hardly needed to revise it. Where does that come from? I think it comes from a higher plane. It comes from God. It comes from guardian angel. I don't know. But it does not entirely come from within yourself. It comes from somewhere else if you open yourself to that.
Yeah.
And it's a hard thing to explain to younger writers. Well, first of all, they have to believe that's possible.
Right. Well, and so many of us, and I'll consider myself in the number, you think, well, but you've got to understand the character, you've got to do the character structure and write those pages out, and then you outline the thing, you've got to make sure everything fits before you sit down to write. Not the way DEAN KOONTZ does it. Though you did that at one time. You did outline early on.
Early on, I did meticulous outlines, and then I found I wasn't really following them that closely.
You throw them away when you're in the middle of it.
Then I deliver the book, and the publisher had bought it based on the outline, and then they would say, well, this isn't the outline. And I would say, yes, but this is better than what the outline would have been. But you could never persuade them of that. They'd spend a year and a half thinking about the outline, and
Marketing and selling
like
that outline, yeah.
So I decided not to. I wrote a novel called Strangers, and I decided with that one, it had 12 major characters, lots of storylines that wove together. It was 900 and some manuscript pages. And I decided I'm just going to carry this in my head, and I'm just going to start with the premise and see who the characters are going to be. And that was the first book I had on the hardcover bestseller list. And I thought, well, then I can stop all this outlining and stuff. This works.
Now, early on, you wrote a lot of sci-fi, and then you segued into what I would call supernatural suspense. Would you agree with the terminology?
There was even a little window in there where I did straight suspense, and I still occasionally do straight suspense. But yeah, I realized at some point science fiction was what I grew up reading, but it wasn't what I was born to write.
And what unites the two faces of DEAN KOONTZ, the sci-fi and the suspense? What joins them in your mind?
I think what the science fictional part of it, which still is there in some of my novels in a kind of very accessible way, not like a science fiction novel for science fiction fans only. I think that, and I've always been a heavy science reader, especially in quantum mechanics and molecular biology. Yeah. And you sometimes will get a story idea out of that. But why I think I have so much science in them is because science is another route to God. Science doesn't say God doesn't exist. Science can't answer questions like that. But science can tell you things and show you things about the world that are pretty amazing. And the more we learn about the complexity of the world, the more we learn about the complexity of a human cell, for instance. It's more complex than a 747. And when you start to look at that complexity, you see the world as a miraculous place. And I think that's how, as my fiction evolved, the science fiction became in support of the supernatural.
And many people have told me, DEAN KOONTZ unites and shows the complementarity between faith and science, and how they fit, and they're not mutually exclusive.
No.
Are you aware of that as you work on your work?
I'm very aware of it. I'm always aware that I'm going to get some criticism for that.
Have you?
Oh, yes. And in fact, I get some really angry letters now and then. But I know when From the Corner of His Eye came out, which tried to take the idea that quantum mechanics shows us very strange things about the world, including the idea of spooky effect at a distance. The idea that a butterfly wing in Tokyo can change the weather in Chicago. That the world is so interlaced that one thing affects the other. And I said, I want to write a novel that shows that's absolutely true about human relationships as well. That a good thing you do here that almost nobody sees can echo through all kind of lives and grow until somebody over here commits a great act of courage because of the small kindness you did here. And it was a very difficult thing to try to show, but when I showed it, I got two kinds of letters. One, I would get letters from priests and clergymen who really loved the whole concept, and then I would get grudging letters from people who didn't believe in anything, but they were grudging, not criticism so much as grudging. They liked the book, but they didn't want to like it because of what the book said. And that, in that case, science served me exactly well in that.
Yeah, the great book I remember reading, The One Doorway Away from Heaven. This entered the bioethical realm, and a frequent guest to this show, Wesley Smith, the author and lawyer who writes about bioethics routinely, you mentioned him at the back end of that book, as I recall. And tell me about that, because it portrayed a bioethical, not a dilemma, or horror story in many cases, that is playing out before our eyes in reality. And it was about a scientist, as I recall, who was bent on breeding disabled people to essentially kill them, to use them.
But the essence of the book, it's built around a disabled girl. And my wife and I, for many, many years now, have worked with a charity that provides service dogs for the disabled. And so we've seen many, many children with severe disabilities and adults. And I've never seen one of them complain, like very healthy people will complain about everything. I've never seen one of them just depressed. They all want to get on with their lives. They want to have this assistant dog that helps them. And I wanted to write a novel in which you saw the value of everybody in society. And One Door Away from Heaven takes this girl that a lot of people would say, what a poor quality of life. And through this girl, you see, she has an immensely amazing quality of life. And I see that in many of these disabled children that we've worked with. And I wanted to show then this utilitarian bioethicist, whom Wesley Smith has written brilliantly about them. I wanted to show how evil this is, the idea that a Down syndrome child shouldn't be allowed to be born, or the utilitarian bioethicists will say that any child with a disability, no matter how small, if they get an infection, they shouldn't be given antibiotics. They should be allowed to die because they're too much of a drag on the world.
The old Peter Singer routine.
Yeah, well, yes, exactly, Peter Singer. And it's nothing different than what we saw in the Nazis or in the Soviet Union, and yet it's cloaked here in ethical terms. And I wanted to write a novel that by the end you understood that little girl was so much more important to the world than that scientist and his ruinous theories. I have a thing about intellectuals. Just because somebody's smart doesn't mean they have any common sense. And intellectuals have often ruined the world.
I'll say. Brother Odd also, as I recall, that also had reflections of the nobility and the worth of every human life, including the disabled, who are part of that story as well, central to that story. I know you work closely via the Canine Companions for Independence, which is a group that provides these service dogs to disabled people. How have the disabled you've worked with enriched your life and changed your work?
First way they changed is when we began to be associated, and you were around a lot of people with disabilities at times, it suddenly dawned on me that I never see them in fiction. If you ever see a spina bifida child in fiction, or if you ever see a quadriplegic in fiction, they're always a figure of pity, or it's about their struggle and how awful their life is. And I suddenly realized, in a little selfish way, here are all these people that never appear in fiction, and I can write about them, and it's going to be something really fresh and interesting. And from that, I evolved into realizing it does something much better than that in the fiction. It shows people, somebody just said to me in another context, why am I interested in this? They were somebody in real life, I won't get into that, but why would you back that person? And I said, because that person thinks outside the box. That person doesn't run with the herd, and I like that. And my fiction often deals with outsiders, people who aren't necessarily welcomed into the inner circles of society. And that holds a mirror up to society in an interesting, different way. And it allows you to do it without, my novels aren't preachy. And the one way you can avoid that is really bring to the reader somebody they don't know, a kind of person they don't know in their life, and that they might not think they're going to like reading about, and then they discover they fall in love with. That is the best you can do, and it's just so much fun to see people writing to you about those kind of characters and how that they've fallen in love with them.
Speaking of falling in love with characters, your character, Odd Thomas, who apparently came to you, as you said a moment ago, when you were working on another novel, he has really taken on a life of his own. There's a forthcoming film. This is the fifth book, right? Or fifth book, Odd Apocalypse. Tell us about this book and how this is a 7-part series you envision. How do you see him in your panoply of characters, and did you intend to write a series character when you gave way or gave in to this inspiration?
Well, I wrote the first one, and I understood from the moment that first chapter essentially wrote itself. I understood as the book went that this was something very special. And when I finished the book, I thought, I have to go on writing about this character. I knew by the end of the first book that he is on a journey. I didn't know how many books at that time, but I knew he was on a journey. His most telling character trait is his humility. But I knew at the end of the first book that he's actually on a multiple book journey to perfect humility. And it ends up being the 7th book. Now, how I'm going to write about perfect humility, I have no idea because I've not experienced it. But every book, you don't necessarily talk about this kind of thing openly, but in your show I can talk about it. Every book deals with a virtue, a particular virtue, and we see that virtue through Odd Thomas. And people may not even realize that as they're reading the book. It's meant to be down there in the subtextual level. But by the time he gets to number 7, it's really clear that he's in a very transcendent state in number 7. But I wanted to write about a fellow who, though he is that good, is nevertheless very funny, somebody you would like to know, and not like a goody two-shoes. But nevertheless, when I delivered it, my publisher at that time didn't like that book at all.
Really?
Wouldn't even talk to me about it. My editor loved it, but my publisher thought it was a disaster. Here was a male lead who didn't bed every woman he encounters, who doesn't use bad language, who hates guns but can use it if he has to, but he'd prefer to use a broom.
He's an action hero.
Yeah, but he doesn't have the usual action hero traits. But then the reviews started coming in, and I don't think that book ever had a bad one. And then the booksellers started coming in, and sales started getting very good. And so I was allowed to go on writing about it. And it's been a journey. There's been a few years between books, but now I've got a new publisher again, and she said, let's move on with this. And so now I'm writing Deeply Odd, and Saint Odd is the final one.
Oh, really? Now, Odd, I've read in interviews you say he is Catholic, and we got a sense of that. He was in Brother Odd, where he goes and actually lives at a monastery, but he's a fry cook from California, this guy. He's a very humble kind of gentle man.
Well, he sees the spirits of the lingering dead.
That's the difference between him and all the other fry cooks.
And as he says, the dead don't talk. I don't know why, except he thinks it's probably we're not meant to know what the dead might know. And it's sort of I'm assuming they haven't checked into purgatory.
Okay. That's what I was about to say. Where do they, because you have Elvis Presley who accompanied him for 3 books. Then suddenly, my favorite, Frank Sinatra showed up. I wish you'd send him to my house for a couple of hours. Frank Sinatra shows up, and in the most recent book, Alfred Hitchcock makes an appearance. Why those figures, and do you believe there are lingering spirits around us?
I have no idea quite how I feel about that exactly. I will tell you the one reason I say I don't know, and that is because the one thing in my life that I really believe was a completely supernatural experience was at the last 14 years of his life, my wife and I brought my father to California because he was destitute, and we took over care of him. We got him an apartment and paid his bills and did all kind of that, which was a very difficult decision to make, given that he had made my life so dark in the early years. But he then became, because of lifelong alcoholism, he developed degenerative alcohol syndrome, and his behavior became more and more violent. And there was a point where we had to move him out of an apartment, not into a nursing home, but into a retirement home where he could come and go. And in that setting, he attacked me with a knife in a public hallway. And I had to take the knife away from him. And in spite of his age, he was a strong guy.
Strong man, yeah.
And that was when he ended up in a psychiatric ward, and I found out his diagnosis was sociopathic personality. But the night before, I was working in my office late, and my fourth line rang, which is my direct line, and I picked it up, and this woman said, "Be careful of your father." And I swear to you, it sounded like my mother, who had been dead for many years then.
Oh my gosh.
And I said, hello, hello, and there was nothing further. And I hung up the phone, and the next day, they called me from the retirement home and said, his behavior is getting so bad, we may have to have him moved out, and right now, you have to come down here and deal with it. And it was close to us, so we could see him regularly. And I went down to the retirement home, and he had a private room, and it was a very nice place, and he was lying on the floor in the entryway, causing a scene, and I had to get him up and take him upstairs, and that's when he came up with the knife. Because if I was particularly careful because of that phone call the night before, and if I hadn't been, I might not have been aware of what was about to happen. I wasn't aware of what was about to happen, but I was paying close attention to him, and when he opened a dresser drawer in his room and came out with the knife, I was surprised, but not surprised.
Terrifying, terrifying. But you do believe we get these signal graces, surely. I mean, from your work, from your interviews, and in a moment I want to segue and talk about your dog, Trixie, who really brought out, I read the memoir, A Big Little Life, that you wrote about her relationship with you and your wife, Gerda. Let's talk about that for a minute. Do you believe that dogs have an eternal sense?
When you are working with dogs in something like CCI, where you watch a dog, just the existence of the dog trained to socialize an autistic child, and they take away all the bad behavior, and the child becomes loving toward the dog and then potentially toward people he's held at a distance, still autistic, but there's something changes in the child. And I've even seen a case where a little girl had a neuromuscular disease that shut down all of her bodily systems, starting with her hands closed like this, and she couldn't open them. And she hadn't opened them for 3 years. Her mother would force them open to wash them. She had stopped speaking a year and a half before she got this assistant dog. She'd stopped walking a year before. Everything we do has muscular, sight, voice, so she would eventually lose everything. And she came to get this dog. She received a dog. It happened to be a dog named after Gerda. And the dogs choose the people. They let the people choose the dog, but they've learned it always works out different, but they have to give the person the chance to choose the dog. And then that person learns, this isn't the dog for me, and the trainers always know. They watch them and they know, they can see. And this dog went right to this little girl, walked right into the room, 30-some dogs brought into a room with 14 people in this graduating class, walked right up to her and sat looking at her. And the little girl could kick her feet against the pedals of her wheelchair when she was excited. And that's how she expressed her excitement when she saw all these dogs. She started kicking pedals. The other dogs shied away from her. The one named Gerda walked over, sat in front of her. That little girl, she was into, I think, 3 days of this, and one day she opened her hand. Now, medical science tells you in this disease, once you lose a function, it never comes back. She opened her hand so she could pet the dog. She started to say, good doggy, and they hadn't heard her speak in quite a long time. Parents have sent her pictures of her. At that time, she didn't look directly at you. She would look like this, you know. They sent us a picture of her looking directly at the camera, hugging the dog. This girl will always have this disease, but this dog has been this enormous grace in her life. When you see things like this, you think the world is so much more mysterious, and that's a big theme of my work. To think you understand the world is to be foolish in the extreme. The world is too complex for us to understand it. We'll always just find it more complex and more mysterious. And I believe dogs have a major role in the world if we'll allow them to do it. I know one dog changed my life.
I remember reading somewhere you quoted a monk came to you and mentioned the Book of Tobit, which clearly talks about an angel taking the form of a dog.
You have to get the right translation, but yes. It was when I had been corresponding with a Norbertine monk in a monastery not far from here. And then one day, a mutual friend was there speaking at their school, and said, I want to bring a couple of them down for dinner, and they came down, and now they've become a really major part of our lives. But it was just Father Hugh and Father Jerome were here, and they were about here an hour or more, and Trixie was here with us, and at one point, Father Hugh looked at Father Jerome and said, what do you think about this dog? And Father Jerome said, what do you think about this dog? And as I recall, they started talking to each other in Latin, so and they said to me, Father Hugh said to me, you should read the book of Tobit. And in that book, this devout Jew who is risking his life to give Jews burials in a time when they were just thrown off the city wall, his whole family is saved, to shorten the story, by this young man who comes and is a champion of the family, and won't go into the whole story, but eventually reveals himself to be the Angel Raphael. And when Tobit says to him, why would you do this for me? And he starts talking about all the wonderful things he had done at the risk of his own life. And he said, but how did you know I did that? And he says, I am the only one who was always with you. And the story is so subtle. The only one who was always with Tobit was this dog. And so when I talked to Father Hugh and Father Jerome about it later, they said, well, there is a theory that when the supernatural enters the world, it doesn't enter it in great, glorious flashes of drama. It enters the world in mundane ways, and a dog might be a perfect way.
And that's certainly a big part of your work. You see that in the Odd series as well.
I actually said in Big Little Life, I think Trixie was a theophany, a presence of God in my life.
When we return, more of my interview with best-selling author Dean Koontz. The World Over Live continues in a moment.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over. Now, more of my exclusive interview with Dean Koontz. Let's talk about the humor in these works, which we haven't touched so far. I always howl laughing when I'm reading your books because there are these hilarious asides, or sometimes central to the text conversation. Where does that humor come from? You've attributed that to your Catholicism.
To a degree, yes. I mean, once you... Odd says about himself, humanity is a prey to fools, and I'm right up front with a baton. And there is a tendency to think that if we believe that this is a fallen world, as Catholics do, we tend to think that, that we do know it's a darker world than it was meant to be. But it's not just that it's dark, it's absurd. It's not what it was meant to be. And when human beings have changed the world, they've changed it in an absurd way. And Odd has a real awareness of the absurdities in everyday life. And when I'm writing, it's very funny. I can sit there laughing out loud like he's talking to me. It doesn't seem like I'm writing his lines. And I wrote a book called Life Expectancy, which is a very comic novel. And it rattles people in the publishing industry because I was first told you can't have humor in a suspense novel. I said, why not? Well, because it'll break the suspense. And I said, no, if you laugh with a character, if he charms you and makes you laugh, then you're going to care more about him. He seems like a real person because laughter is one of the big ways we deal with life. And it's just the way I've always dealt with it, so it's fun to be able to bring that to the fiction.
No, it shines through the work, and it makes the characters very human, which frankly, a lot of suspense, they're a little inhuman and removed from you. It's all device and formula, and you kind of feel manipulated when it's done. Not so in a Dean Koontz novel. Now, you've been quoted as saying you give your characters free will when you write them. Explain to people what that means.
This is one of the hardest things I've ever had to explain to young writers, and I'm not sure I ever get it across. But it really started, I started doing this back with strangers when I didn't have an outline. And I start with a character that I think I know some interesting things about, but I give the character free will. I don't do charts of what his traits are. I don't do anything like that. And I let that character tell me his story. And I say I give the character free will like God gave it to us. If the character is going to make a major mistake, I let him make the major mistake. If the mistake is something that's going to cause me problems in plot
Chapter
points,
12?
yes, I nevertheless, all right, there's a reason. When I first began to do this, it was very difficult because I would want to say, oh, no, 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 you can't do that.
Dangerous.
Yeah, you can't do that, or that's a silly way to deal with this problem. I've learned over the years that it will never fail me. When I was writing Life Expectancy, it opens with a scene between the man, his child is being born this night, and his father is dying at the other end of the hospital from a stroke. And he's moving back and forth between these two events. And the whole novel is going to be about that child, but there's also this other character in the father's waiting lounge, and I didn't know what that character was going to be. I just knew it was going to be a difficult person and a lot of problems for this man for the next 20-some years. And when I started to write the line, I knew the line was, I mentioned the decor of the father's lounge. It was not very appealing. But worse than the decor was the chain smoking, and I just wrote clown. And I stopped and said, clown? No, no, no. And I backed up and took the word out, and I thought, what could he be? He can't be a clown. And then I reminded myself, this always works. Let him be a clown. He's not a clown with big shoes. He's sort of an Emmett Kelly clown, you know, with a ragged suit.
Bozo.
Yeah, and there's a circus in town, and his wife is delivering the same night, and he's a very dangerous person. And I went back and said, okay, clown. After the book was done, it's impossible to see this book if he hadn't been a clown. Yeah. It wouldn't work otherwise. Yeah. And so I say, you've got to get into that. You get in touch with something bigger than yourself, and you let it speak to you. And it's just sort of giving up, partly it's giving up ego altogether when you're writing. You have to stop thinking, how will people read this? Will they think this is cool or not? Just, you give it all up and say, okay, wherever I'm going to go with this. Sometimes it's panicky because you think, I'm 2/3 of the way through and I don't know if there's an ending to this.
How do I get out of this thing?
But there always is, and it always works.
Yeah, you've said writing can be like a little prayer. It can be like prayer. I imagine in the approach you're outlining here, it really is about trust and trusting that God will fill the gaps that you might not be able to.
I've often said that writing talent, like any talent, is an unearned grace. It was something you were given. You didn't do anything to earn it. I was writing stories when I was 8 years old. And when I was in high school, my English teacher said, I was going to major in history in college, and she said, no, you've got writing talent, you idiot. She was an ex-WAC in World War II, so she spoke like that. Said, you have got to major in English. And she changed my life to some degree right there I so respected her that I did. And so you're given these things, and part, I think, of what life is to recognize what you've been given, and then you have, I believe, a kind of obligation to use it to the best of your ability. I have seen over my life how many people I know that you can look at who have a talent or ability that they don't want to explore. They've decided they want to be something else, but that isn't what they've been given. And I've seen people who have multiple talents and won't exploit any of them. Yeah. And so when you're actually opening yourself to exploit, well, believe me, writing is the only thing I've been given. If I pick up a tool in this house, everybody, please sit down, put it down before anybody's hurt or you damage anything. There's nothing else I can do. I was fortunate enough to recognize that. And so when I'm doing it, I do it for the sheer love of it. I think it was in a recent interview, somebody asked me, if you stop selling, I guess you would stop doing this. What else would I do? I loved doing it when I wasn't making any money out of it. Why would I not want to do it if I stopped making money now? I did it for many years without making much money. You do it just to see how far you can push this. And there's always a new frontier. I just had my first idea from a dream. And for years when I would do book signings, people would say, "You must get a lot of your ideas from dreams." And I would say, "I never get an idea from
I
a
don't
dream."
remember any of my dreams.
And then one night here just a couple of months ago, I sat up in bed at 4 in the morning from this amazing dream in which I had received the entire story. And it's a very unusual dream. It's almost a dream within a dream. And I thought, this probably won't work because it's a very unusual idea. But the thing is writing itself as I speak, so it's working.
Amazing. Your work, it's filled with redemption, the recognition of evil and the presence of evil in the world. And you once said that your work and all work should have a moral purpose. Do you feel that purpose is increased given what's happening now culturally and where we are in this moment?
We're in a terrible place culturally, and in many ways we're in a terrible place. Sometimes I have a bone to pick with people on our side of things who bemoan the culture but don't wade into it. And you have to wade into it or you can't complain about it. And it's, believe me, writing things with what I write in, there are people who are hostile to it, and there are reviewers who are very hostile to it. But that's just part of it.
Part of the deal.
Yeah, and it's, let them beat you up. I haven't had any of them beat me up that I respected the way they beat me up. So
if it's not a respectful beating, ignore it.
If sometimes they just aren't attacking me because they don't agree with what I believe about the world. Hey, every writer has to have a worldview, and this happens to be mine. I get mail from people saying, "I love your books, but I generally like noir fiction, and why couldn't you write a noir novel in which everybody dies in the end and it all has no meaning?" And I say to them, well, because that's not what I believe. I could do that, but you can go 1,000 other places and get that. So why do you have to have that from me? And it isn't what I believe, so it would be phony and it wouldn't read properly anyway.
Yeah.
I think because of my father's behavior and that as a child, I was really early on. I never had a problem, as some people do, especially as they get to college and they're told that everything is relative and so forth. I always knew evil was real in the world. I lived with it, and so it didn't seem. I never fell into the idea that it's all relative and that there isn't such a thing as real evil. That's such an antiquated idea. You have to know, and there's some people on our side too who say, "I don't want to read a book in which evil is explored," and I even mentioned this to Cardinal Dolan. I received a couple of letters from.
I know he's a fan.
Yeah, when he was an archbishop, he wrote me, and it was so gratifying to have the archbishop write you. I think he said in one letter, "Your work is apostolic," and I thought, oh, I need a new hat. I'm not
We're going to suspend a nice red bolero right over the.
I mean a larger hat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, my head has just swelled way up, and so it's. I will say to those people, say, "Well, I don't want to read about evil." I say, "Well, we're called upon to be witness to it, and you can't. You start to lose track of its really existence or how immediate it is in every day of our lives, and you don't fully understand it if you don't read about it. And I write about it to fully understand it. I don't write bad things happen in my novel, but I don't dwell on gore. And long ago, I realized there was no point at all in trying to write about sex because it's so boring to write about it, and it's also. It brings the wrong tone into anything you do. And so there will be very villainous people in my stories, but I'm not going to write about disembowelments or intricate beheadings and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I can't go to a movie that's got a lot of blood in it.
Yeah.
I can't watch it. So you don't get that in mine either. But evil and good it's an eternal battle. T.S. Eliot said it's the one thing that never changes.
That's right.
The eternal battle of good and evil, and it's all of history.
And do you think we've lost a sense of that? Because in so much of the cinema we see, television, the novels, there is this inverted moral universe, so that in fact, the latest trend is to take the villains, whether it's the old stepmother from Snow White, and suddenly turn her into the anti-villain. She's the anti-hero. She's the centerpiece of the thing. In fact, she's just misunderstood. Like the Wicked Witch of the West, just a misunderstood woman. It was really that Dorothy who was the horrible creature. Do you think it confuses society? and sort of inverts reality in that that isn't how the world functions.
I think it's meant to confuse. I used to just think people would write these things because it was cool, it was different, it was, oh, nobody will think of making the Wicked Witch the heroine of this or that. I've gotten wiser as I've gotten older, and I've seen that a lot of this, as I in fact have gotten to know some people who do these kind of projects in the book world, but especially in the film world, and I see, oh no, this is entirely intentional. This is part of, this is really a war of good and evil, and there are some people who just don't want to accept that evil exists, so they want to invert it and say that, well, good can be actually, it depends on your culture, it depends on your worldview. No, it doesn't really.
It's all relative.
And that's another misuse of multiculturalism, is to say that every culture is equal. Every culture is equal in its integrity as a culture. Some cultures are a little wiser than other cultures, or otherwise the world, there wouldn't be certain cultures ascend and some disappear
decline.
Forever.
Yeah.
And secondly, if you're going to say that, one of the things that's really fascinating about all cultures is they have a sense of good and evil. And then when you're told that this culture is superior to ours, you'll find out many of the things in that culture are the things that those people telling you that hate about our culture. But they don't hate it in that culture because they don't have to live in that culture, I think. And but I've gotten to see it's intentional and very sad, I think.
Final question. I want to talk to you about the Catholic Church and your conception of it, because so much of the work of an artist is fed by these external signs and symbols, and they fill your work, but the reservoir, which artists immemorial in the literary world, certainly Graham Greene and Flannery O'Connor, down to you, that was the well that everyone tapped into. Are you concerned that perhaps we're losing the traditional expression of that faith, and that in that we lose something more, something cultural as well?
Very much so. But I will say this, I do see a change occurring.
With
I think
Pope Benedict.
Yep.
And John Paul before him.
And I see it taking place in the culture here and there. And it's intriguing to me. I see things happening that 10 years ago, nobody would have approached the subject that way or would have done it. It even extends to something like, if you set aside the violence of the picture and everything else and set aside the horrible thing that happened in the movie theater, the new Batman movie is very strangely, and so was the one before it, has underlying it certain values that you do not see in Hollywood films generally.
I agree.
And I think it has to be intentional in that director. He's a very bright man, so I think it's intentional there. You see it in places that you don't expect to see it. And, you know, anything, any negative trend particularly, the nihilism of our culture, which is what I would wrap it up in, if one word, you can only carry that so far. And it no longer is romantic, it's no longer
chic.
Cool or chic. No, it's just boring. And it seems to me we got to the boring part of nihilism a long, long time ago. But some people still live it. But I'm seeing more and more people, I think because the world's becoming a scarier place. And my hope is that as this advances, people will turn toward, I get so much mail, we get 10 to 20,000 letters a year. When Odd Thomas came out, we got 50,000 letters. Certain books will generate a huge amount of mail. And those books, it always strikes me that those books are like Odd Thomas. They've got a high spiritual quality to them. Or From the Corner of His Eye was another one that did that. And the mail is from people saying how the book affected them and how, I don't mean to say that the books changed somebody's life, but I remember as a kid how profoundly a book could affect me. And that books saved me, I say, as a child, and got me out of that environment in that house and showed me another way to live. So when people write to me and say, I've been so depressed for so long and I found this book, or somebody said, read this book because I know how depressed you've been and this will make you feel better. And From the Corner of Eye, I got a lot of letters like that, and they would say, it's not a Pollyanna book because it isn't. Bad things happen to good people.
Right. Well, it's honest. It's real.
Yeah. And they said, but I ended up feeling better than I felt in a long time. And now I've read 20 books in a month.
Boy.
And I feel so much better, and I haven't heard such positive stuff. And I like those reviews that say it's realistic. It isn't Pollyanna fiction, but it does give you a sense that life has meaning and purpose. And when you really have bought into nihilism, that life has no meaning and purpose, I find it really difficult to know why anybody can go on, let alone how. So I think change has to come, and I'm hopeful. Like you, I'm afraid a lot of people don't realize the culture they live in, what it was built upon. Right. And when you start trying to push out of the culture the very thing that formed the entire culture, the culture is going to collapse, and it's going to be a very terrible collapse. And I think people are having a sense of that. I think the last number of years, it's been getting spookier and spookier, and I think people are thinking, there's bad things coming, and they see the rest of the world, and they see that the way a lot of the rest of the world has chosen to move has not worked. And now we're on some of the same paths. And I mean, I'm told you go into Europe, and a lot of churches are nearly empty.
Oh no, they're empty. And that's why Pope Benedict's, his entire agenda to reform the liturgy, bring back the traditional music. People look at that and some say, oh, he's trying to go take us back to the Stone Age. Why is he doing this? In fact, I think he has a sense that these are the kernels, the foundations that hold the culture up. And by reawakening those traditions and making people realize the importance of them, you're speaking to something much more significant, to the full body of doctrine and belief and tradition that you explore subtly in the background in your work.
I would think any novelist would tell you that, who's self-aware of what they're writing. I mean, if you're grinding something out to pay the rent, no. But any writer would tell you that underlying everything is symbol. That, and at first, first there was the word, and every word is, in a sense, is a symbol of something. And so underlying it's like one of the Norbertines, Father Jerome, said to me, I've learned that in your books, most of the character names are important, so I try to find out what it means. And he said, but there's this piece I wrote called The Moonlit Mind, and he said, there was a nanny in it. She's a Japanese-American woman, and she's a nanny, and she's not good. And he said to me, I figured out the other names. I know why these are there. Now, this is not anything a reader needs to know. Sure. And in fact, shouldn't even know, because symbol speaks to people subconsciously. Right. And it helps them bring them into a story in a way that they can't do only consciously by appealing to the conscious mind. And so a lot of names have cultural references that people will get on a deeper level. And some of them are very esoteric, but you have fun with them. And he said to me, but I can't get the nanny's name, Nanny Sayo, S-A-Y-O. Is that anything? And I said, yes, she's an evil character, and Sayo in Japanese means born in the night. So
that's a good tip-off for the Japanese speakers out there.
And if a thing is underlying, if it's filled with symbolic content, the reader doesn't have to see that.
That's
and
right.
Actually shouldn't see that.
But they experience it nonetheless.
They experience it nonetheless. And that's why the Church lost its way, I think, in Vatican II, by saying we don't need the Latin, and we don't need and churches got plainer and plainer. Yeah. And that was stripping away things that weren't just things. They were symbols of deeper things. And they were things that spoke to people. Sometimes, I said earlier something about intellectuals, and sometimes, and the Catholic Church is a very intellectual faith.
It is.
And that's one of the great things about it. We have such a deep pool of intellectual people, and good ones, who explain the faith to the faithful and did a brilliant job of it. And but not all of us are endowed with the same intellect. I'm not going to sit down in a room with Stephen Hawking and be able to talk to him about cosmology. Yeah. And a lot of people do not have the ability. Their grace they've been given is something else. Maybe they're a fabulous iron worker or something else, but they don't have the ability to sit down with the faith and think through in the way that the great intellectuals of the faith thought it through. But the symbols speak to them in the same way. They convey that information. And when the church started taking all that away, to say we just have to make it more open and easier for people. What they actually did was make it more difficult because they took away all that beauty and all that symbolism, or not all of it, but a lot of it. And what really happened was that those were the touchstones by which a lot of people came to understand their faith.
Yeah.
And that was taken away.
It actually reduces it, as you said, it reduces it to a conceptual faith, to something, to an intellectual exercise rather than experiential one.
Yes, exactly. And there's a lot of people who the faith comes to the entire experiential part of it. And they can be just as devout as somebody who's spent a lot of time thinking about it. And so I think that's where the church went wrong, and I'm glad to see that it's now starting to move back, and I think it will continue to move back.
Sure, no, well, it wins in the end, right?
Yeah.
Final question. What is the next horizon for Dean Koontz? What type of book, what genre is still unexplored that you would like to? I know you've written a number of children's books over the years, including Trixie and Jinx, which is available now on app for children, which so many are reading on these devices.
iPads and things, yeah. Well, you know, you go on only so long in a career writing a certain kind of thing, and suddenly you have throughout my career, there's always been moments where something happens to you and you move to a different level. And that happened with From the Corner of His Eye, and then One Door Away from Heaven came right after it. And then later there was a step where I wanted to try, I suddenly thought, those books were very ornate, very long, and I thought, can you get all the substance and the same emotional feeling and the same intellectual feeling in a book that's much more briskly structured and written, and how do you do that? And for a while I was doing books like that, Breathless or whatever, and they were shorter, but I felt in their way they had everything the other books had. And I just told you about this dream I had.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you a little bit more about the dream. I, as I said, never had an idea from a dream. And I sat up at 4 o'clock in the morning, wide awake in bed, with a whole remembered dream. And in the dream, I was having lunch with Thomas Tryon. Do you remember who Thomas Tryon was?
No, who's Thomas Tryon?
He was an actor. He played in The Cardinal. That was
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And then he became a novelist, and he wrote The Other. And then he had a number of bestsellers. He died many years ago, I think close to 18, 20
Did you know
years
him?
ago. I didn't know him. Never met him. I hadn't thought about him in 15 years. And yet in a dream, I'm at lunch with Thomas Tryon. And he's having we're having a delightful lunch. We're drinking wine and talking, and we're celebrating because his new book is out, and it's his best success ever. And he's getting, critics love it as well as the public. And I'm so happy for him in the dream, and he's happy. And we're talking about the book. And we're talking about scenes in the book. And in the dream, the scenes we talk about became dream within a dream, and I would literally see the scenes. And I woke up with this whole idea in my head. And I couldn't get back to sleep. So when I got down to my desk, I wrote out a few notes thinking, I'm going to forget this. And the next thing, I just couldn't stand it. I had to see if this would actually write. And it writes really well. I mean, it's flowing really well. It's totally different than anything I've written before, but I think my audience will like it. And it has a quality of fable about it, and it's really fascinating. And I said to a friend, it might even been Wesley Smith, I said, the only thing I'm afraid of is when I pass over, Thomas Tryon will be waiting with attorneys in a plagiarism suit. So,
he's going to want those royalties back.
and Wesley, who is a lawyer, said, don't worry, there aren't any lawyers in heaven. And I said, well, I didn't say heaven. I said, passing over.
That's good. So, an important distinction, but one I don't think you need to worry about.
Well, we all need to worry.
Dean Koontz, thank you so much for the time and for inviting us into your lovely home and inviting us into your mind and work.
Well, thanks for having me on the show. I have really enjoyed it.
Odd Apocalypse is on sale everywhere and at all the usual online retailers. That's all the time we have. The show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Go to RaymondArroyo.com. The Twitter and Facebook pages are linked on the left-hand side of the site. Tell me what you thought of tonight's show. And remember, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen in the meantime. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, I'm Raymond Arroyo. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye now. Bye.